This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien, and this is the Shaping Opinion podcast. Our guest today is Bishop Joseph Stirckland. He's a Roman Catholic bishop. He's the Bishop Emeritus of Tyler, Texas. He's the chairman and founder of an organization called pillarsoffaith.net. He's developed a reputation for taking strong traditional positions that have put him in situations that I'm sure he never imagined when he first entered the clergy. We're going to talk about that and much more in this episode. Bishop Strickland, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be here.
It's good to have you. And before we get started and all the things that I wanted to talk to you about, you had mentioned before we started recording for this podcast that you were an avid runner when you started as a priest. And I'm wondering, do you get back to that running much these days, or are there other things that you do for exercise?
No, I try to exercise, pretty much just calisthenics and, try to keep the weight down and all of that. But running, I just feel like I was sort of pushing my bet for, my knees are great, my hips are great. So I just thought it'd be good not to push it, but try to exercise and stay in good health.
Well, that's one way to do it. And one way not to stay in good health is, I think, to watch the Dallas Cowboys. You're in Texas, and you said you're a Dallas Cowboys fan, but they're not doing so well these days, are they?
Yeah, they kind of go in fits and starts. To me, the heyday of the Cowboys was during the time of the, Don Meredith and all of that back, really when I was a kid. Tom Landry was a real gentleman coach in my estimation. And I think those were the best days of the Cowboys, but I still try to hang in there.
Well, I'm from Pittsburgh, and the Steelers played the Cowboys in I think 3 Super Bowls, but no, it was 2 Super Bowls. Yeah. And they played them in 2 Super Bowls. And I remember one time my wife, she got a discount on some wallpaper that had the Dallas Cowboys logo in it. And it was the only time we've ever decorated that I told my wife she has to take it back.
Yeah.
But so much for Cowboys. But another thing about me is I'm a Roman Catholic, and I followed you from afar, and I really admired your story. And I know we'll get into that. So if people who are watching, and a lot of people who are watching are not Catholic, so they aren't familiar with your story, I wanted to just start with the basics. Where did you start when you became a priest? What made you want to become a priest?
Well, grew up in a very Catholic family that really treasured our Catholic faith. And so becoming a priest was a good thing for the family. Really wasn't pushed to do that at all. My parents just wanted all of us. I grew up in a family of 7 kids. Really 6 of us grew up. We had a brother that died as an infant. But I think my parents just wanted us to be happy, to find a path that was fulfilling to us. So when they saw that I was flourishing in the seminary, they were very supportive. But an Irish Catholic family, my mother's from Australia, but it was an Irish Catholic family transplanted to Australia. So those Catholic roots were a big part of it. I had a good experience in the seminary, went to the University of Dallas, began there as a freshman in college, and the seminary was attached to the university. So I was there for 8 years, had some good mentors, had some good friends. I really feel like it was an environment that nurtured that initial question. Really, I entered the seminary just thinking, well, I want to check this out. I definitely, and I think I wasn't terribly wise, but the wisdom there was maybe instinctively, I knew I had so much to learn about the Catholic Church, about her history, about, the complexities of the hierarchy and all of that, which I grew up in a little mission church in Atlanta, Texas, and really had no idea of the vast Catholic world that I was entering into, even becoming a priest.
That's, it's a question I wanted to ask you towards the end of the interview, but I thought it might make sense to ask it right now. And that is, you've been a priest now for a long time and now a bishop. Was there any point in your service, I guess, to the church that you really felt this is unbelievable? And I mean this, I don't want to say a miracle, but it might be a miracle where you hit that moment where you thought, I became a priest, I joined the clergy for this. What was that?
Well, I would say, and I think miracle is a good word, because the church is about miracles. It's about supernatural faith, and in many ways, as I say, I still feel like the kid that grew up on 100 acres outside of a little town called Atlanta, Texas, in a very non-Catholic area. But it's amazing how God uses all of those threads of experience to build a life and to bring influences. And I think the experience of being very much in the minority in the Catholic community there in East Texas really has become a positive, because I'm comfortable speaking to people who, as you said on your podcast, there are a lot of non-Catholics. And I know there are a lot of questions and a lot of misconceptions about the Catholic Church. And so I've always been comfortable discussing that. I mean, as a kid in grade school, we used to have pretty, I guess you could call them arguments or heated discussions, at least, about things about the Catholic faith, because, I was really the only kid in my class that was willing to sort of engage there and talk about it. And we had some good conversations, even in the midst of sometimes getting a little heated about it, because, especially kids, they're inheriting what their parents had given them, and they are, it's sort of defending your parents as much as anything in those years. So, but I've had good experiences as a priest. As I've said, I was the first vocation director for the Diocese of Tyler, because it became a diocese shortly after I became a priest. And I've said many times that the path and the work of priesthood isn't always easy, but I've never really felt any serious regret or doubt about the path. I mean, sometimes it's not fun, but I've known that's where I was supposed to be.
And that's the key. When that you just have that sense, you're in the right place at the right time for whoever you're with in that experience. You talked about misconceptions, and I did want to ask about that too, because I have friends and people that aren't Catholic, and they'll make certain comments, and me being Catholic, I'm usually surprised by it because I'm not aware. One of the better examples of that is when people think that the Pope is like the President of the United States. They think it's almost like the Pope's elected and the Pope serves the church and the Pope has to respond to the people, or and my answer to them is, well, it's 2,000 years old. It predates American democracy by a lot. And so it's not a democracy. How would you describe it? And how do you answer that when people ask you those types of questions?
Well, it definitely, it's not a democracy, and it is difficult for the American. I mean, I love the United States. I've been taught to be patriotic. My father was in the Navy. That's how he, as a young man from East Texas, where I grew up, that's how he met my mother in Australia. So I've always loved the country. I've always prayed for the United States, and really been concerned in recent years for where we're headed, because some of the basic values that the nation is founded on have been sort of shaken. And really, I have to say the same thing in the church. But, really, Tim, I've said along this past several years, I think there are a lot of parallels with what's been happening in the church and in the United States with questions of leadership and questions of what are our values. As I've said many times, the Catholic Church, whether you believe it or not, the church claims, and I believe that it's true, the church claims a divine mandate established by Jesus Christ. It's the only church that has the audacity to even claim that. I mean, you've probably seen the charts of different denominations and different religions who founded them. The Catholic Church is the only one bold enough to say God founded it, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And I think that's really the point of departure, that people, if they don't understand that, they're not going to understand the Catholic Church. Well, you mentioned the Pope, whether it's Pope Leo or Pope Francis or the popes that we've lived with, or going back to Simon Peter, the first pope in our faith, they're men that are certainly flawed and sinners like all of us. Some of them have become saints, and some of them have been far from saints, but they're just men. And again, my experience of growing up, I mean, a lot of my family wasn't Catholic. My own grandmother, my father's mother, was Church of Christ, and she had a lot of problems with the Catholic faith. And we kind of called a truce in the family. I mean, I was just a kid, but my parents called a truce and said, we just don't need to discuss this anymore, because she would get very upset and my mother would get upset, and then my father's kind of in the middle. But those kind of conflicts and misunderstandings. I mean, I remember, because I was in the seminary when Paul VI died, and my grandmother, trying to be loving and compassionate, said, I mean, she was acting like God had died for us. And I said, and we called her Granny. I said, Granny, he was a man who serves the church, but the church goes on. I mean, we're sad that a man has died, but it's not shattering to us. I mean, it's not God. But that, I think, is the impression, maybe not thinking he's God, but thinking he's so significant to us, which the Petron office is very significant because Christ established it. But the men that occupy the chair of Peter, we pray for them because they make mistakes. Some of them were really scoundrels in history. And so we don't rely on the Pope to be the basis of the church. Jesus Christ is the Lord of the church. He still guides the church with his Holy Spirit. And that, I think, even Catholics are not as clear about that in these days as they should be.
Well, let's talk about their governance structure, and I'm going to use a parallel that people can relate to. Then I'm going to ask about the church, and that is, so in America, we have laws. Laws are created by legislators, and they're passed, and the president signs them into law, and then there's the judiciary that enforces them. So we're familiar with how governments work. Now, in the church, because non-Catholics will say, well, why doesn't the Pope just decide this, or why doesn't the Pope just order that? And or they think that is what happens. They think that because the church has a certain position on things like, let's say, anything from climate change to abortion, that the Pope can make that decision almost like an autocrat. So on the one hand, they think the Pope's like the president, and he serves the people, and he's elected almost. That's a misconception. And the other misconception is they think that the Pope is like a king, and he can just make decisions, and that's the way it goes. And but it's almost never in between, And I wondered, how do decisions get made in the church on certain policies on some of these things, and how are they enforced?
Well, the mystery of the church, Tim, is what you're touching on, and the Pope is, the Petron office, we believe as Catholics, Jesus Christ established it to be the earthly leadership of the church. The Pope is, and that's probably where some of the confusion comes from, because we use some language that is pretty strong. The supreme lawgiver is one title of the Pope, the Vicar of Christ. But what people, Catholic or not, need to understand is that the principle that guides the Pope is obedience to Jesus Christ, obedience to him as Lord of the universe, Lord of the church. And always through that lens is what a Pope or a bishop, I mean, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome with significant universal authority in the church, but by office, he's the Bishop of Rome, and that's through tradition in the church. That's how the Pope becomes the Pope, because the one who's elected to be the new Bishop of Rome by office is the Pope, fills the Petrine office. But the Pope always has to look to Christ. And understanding Jesus Christ as truth incarnate, as truth itself, truth as a person, then, I mean, to me, that's a big part of what helps us understand the church and understand where the guide rails are for the Pope. I mean, people can have the impression, I mean, you use terminology like supreme lawgiver, and you think, well, the Pope can do anything he wants. In a sense, you could say that, but the mandate is always guided by the truth that is Jesus Christ. And that's been the challenge that we faced. You know, I pray for Pope Francis all the time, but he at least allowed, it was confusing, it wasn't clear, it was a bit murky a lot of times, but he certainly allowed impressions of things that were contrary to what Christ has said through his church through the ages. I mean, just the example of marriage. The church teaches marriage is between a man and a woman for life, open to children. I mean, that's a easy, simple capsule. I mean, marriage is a mystery, as it says in Scripture, but that is the basics. It only is between a man and a woman. It is a lifetime commitment, even though divorce is rampant. Marriage, as what the church teaches, what is marriage? It's a lifetime commitment, and it's open to children. Not necessarily are children born to every marriage, but it's open to children. That's the basic definition of marriage. That comes from God. And, you know, what the church teaches is nobody's going to change that teaching. I mean, people have flirted with the idea, and people say, oh, the church will wake up finally and get to the truth of, you know, that marriage can be between two men or between two women, or some of the other iterations that kind of grow out of that, going down a false path. The church will never change what God has ordained marriage to be. I mean, it's basically alluded to in the book of Genesis. God made them male and female. And so those kinds of divine truths, the Pope doesn't have the authority to change. He can, you know, he can legislate things. I mean, he is the supreme lawgiver, but we pray that the Holy Spirit guides the church to avoid creating a law that's contrary to divine law, but because that becomes a big problem. It's called heresy. And so that is really what we always have to keep returning to. And you mentioned the questions and the confusions and the misunderstandings of the church. When those are there, then there's a lot of room for error within the church and within the global society. I mean, you mentioned climate change. You know, from what I understand, the scientific world is divided about that. I mean, I'm no scientist. I don't know about climate change. And certainly we are stewards of creation, but that can't override the mandate of the church for the salvation of souls. And sometimes you get the impression, okay, what's the most important thing, preserving this world or the call to eternal life with God, the salvation of souls? The church says the most important thing is the salvation of souls. That's why she exists. I studied canon law, the very last canon in the Code of Canon Law, and there are over 2,000 different laws, but the very last one says all of this is about the salvation of souls. So how do souls get saved? They follow the truth that is Jesus Christ. He's revealed the truth to us. And so that's the challenge for me, for you, for everyone, for Catholics, for non-Catholics, is to live the truth. And it is challenging. I'm a sinner. All of us are. If we're smart enough to know who we are, we know we're sinners. We need to ask God's forgiveness. We need to repent, and we need to be grateful for God's mercy, giving us a chance after chance to get it right, or at least do better.
Well, you mentioned a name when you were explaining that, and I thought that was very timely, I think, because you were talking about the issue of, certain things where you have the church kind of rule of law, and you had, in the term you used, you said Pope Francis left it open sort of to interpretation. So it's not like he came down with a decision. I'm a PR person. That's my life's work. I've spent decades in the public relations world doing lots of things, issues management, crisis work, and things like that. And I always, when I say to people, I may not be an expert in science, like when it was during COVID, but I know when someone's lying to me. And that's what I am an expert in. I can tell when people are lying. I can see the tells. And it's not the lying part, but when I have seen Pope Francis, now for people that don't know, the current Pope is Pope Leo the 14th. The Pope before him was Pope Francis, and Pope Francis had a way, and I will call this a PR thing. He had a way to say two opposite things, so that when people would quote Pope Francis, they could choose which side of the argument they wanted to be on, because based on what the Pope said last week or this week. And I saw that as a PR defense, because, and I'll go to the example that you mentioned, same-sex marriage. So you could find something he said that was against same-sex marriage in keeping with church doctrine. But if you looked, you could find something he said that left that open to interpretation. And he might have said it a week or two after he said the other thing. And he never said, I changed my mind. He said both things. And I know that for you, that hits home, because you would speak out. And it wasn't necessarily welcome when you said that. But how would you describe that whole process of speaking bilaterally?
Well, it confuses the truth is the problem. Something is true or not. I believe there is truth that God has revealed to us. The church teaches that there are truths that God has revealed that are unchanging, that guide us to flourish in this world and to the salvation of our souls. And for the Pope to be ambiguous, from my estimation, it's contradictory to what the Pope's about. I just said the papal office is about proclaiming Christ, guiding humanity in the light of Christ. Christ wasn't ambiguous. He was clear about what he told us. He said the gate to heaven is narrow. So for the Pope to be ambiguous, and I pray for Pope Francis, but that's the Pope not doing his job. I mean, when Pope Francis said, "Who am I to judge?" I don't think people really saw the significance of that, because the power of binding and loosing is exactly what the Petrine office possesses, we believe, by divine authority. And so for the Pope to say, "Who am I to judge?" It's like, well, who else is there? That's the job. And I think all of that confusion in a time when many people I mean, Catholic and non-Catholic have dismissed some of the basic teachings of the church and said, oh, the church is wrong. The church will either get with the modern world or it'll disappear. The church isn't going to disappear. And what will happen, really, Tim, is the modern world will come back to the truth, because the truth is what lasts. I mean, you kind of alluded to, with your experience and the wisdom that you've gained, you have kind of a truth detector that's built into us. We can hear the message. And I mean, one thing that is always in my lifetime, and I'm 66 years old, and I believe that we can just use basic criteria. If it's easier, we need to ask some questions, because so much in my lifetime about the church has been easier. It's like, oh, we can relax this, and we don't really require that. But if we look to Christ, he says, you must be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. And he follows that by saying, yes, it's impossible for you, but all things are possible for God. So don't despair, don't give up. But the bar is very high for living the truth that Jesus Christ has proclaimed. And there's been a tendency in my lifetime to keep lowering the bar and say, oh, it's really, that's an ideal that you don't really have to live up to. I mean, that's been said about marriage, that, oh, it's an ideal that, we can't expect people to really live this and monogamous for a whole lifetime and all of that. But that's what Christ taught us. And I think it diminishes the human family when we sort of give in and say, well, we're not really. Jesus didn't mean it when he said, you must be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. It's like we're living. He said, just be mediocre and you'll be okay. But that isn't what Christ said. And I think we lose a lot, whether it's the Pope or bishops or just the church in popular, culture, seen as saying, you don't really need to live these ideals. I mean, look at the saints, look at the martyrs, look at these people who have been canonized. I mean, we just had the canonization of two young men. Pier Giorgio was older than Carlo Acutis, but they're both young men, lived in Italy, and dedicated their young lives as men to being faithful to Jesus Christ, and gave up a lot in order to do that. Those are the models we look to. And where the saints remind us that this call to perfection, God does make it possible for different individuals. I mean, and the saints inspire. I mean, like, look at Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, but she's known to the world as Mother Teresa. She inspired people tremendously. I was just in Poland, and Maximilian Kolbe, I mean, his life, a great inspiration. So we need that inspiration. I mean, we've, had the tragic death of Charlie Kirk. What did he do? He inspired people to be better, to be the best of who they are. That's what the church is about. Charlie wasn't Catholic, but, a lot of what he said, not everything, but a lot of what he said is very much in line with what the Catholic Church says, and certainly calling people to be the best they can be, not for worldly gain, but for everlasting life.
Maximilian Kolbe was a Catholic priest in Poland during World War II. And if people aren't familiar with his story, he basically volunteered to take the place of another prisoner. And he ended up dying in, I think it was Auschwitz, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, I had the chance to see the cell where he was just before he died. And saintly courage was very evident. And he inspired Catholics and non-Catholics. He inspired people who were not even believers in God, because he was so dedicated and so strong. They actually had to inject poison, put him to death, because he'd been in a starvation cell and they couldn't get him to die. He was evangelizing even in the starvation cell. There's a movie out about that. I haven't seen it, but I've heard that it does a good job of explaining just those last days of his life when he was there in Auschwitz, inspiring and aggravating the guards, because he was inspiring a lot of the other prisoners, even as he was being starved and they were trying to get him to die. So, I mean, and the witness of the saints is tremendous in the history of the church. The martyrs and the saints who lived their lives in holiness.
You talk about martyrs. There was, when I was growing up, there was this assumption that all the saints were martyrs, but they weren't. But I think there's an issue. There was a news story years ago, and it grabbed my attention for this reason. And it had nothing to do with Catholicism, but it was Christianity. There was a shopping mall somewhere in Africa, and a group of Muslim radicals came in and they started shooting up the mall. And there were people trapped in different stores in the mall, and they were hiding under tables and clothes racks and places like that. And the Muslim, the radical, the terrorists who had rifles, they were going from store to store throughout the mall, and they would ask people a question. They would basically say, "Are you Christian or are you Muslim?" And all the person had to do to save their own life was to say, "I'm a Muslim." That they weren't, it wasn't an exam or anything like that. They were just going to let them run out of the mall if they said, "I'm a Muslim." You had people, and this is, I don't know what year it was. It wasn't that long ago. It might have been 10 years ago. But you had people in this day and age who refused to lie about that, knowing that they were going to get shot. And when I read that story, it stuck with me. These are modern day martyrs. But when I read that story, I really asked myself, could you do that? Could I do that? And you hope you can do it. You hope you never have to do it. But how do you see that? Do people take this? I mean, a lot of people, I'm sure there are even, people in clergy would say, well, save your own life. But that's really not the example of the martyrs, is it?
No. Well, it's not the example of Christ. He could have saved himself, there before Pilate, if he had played his cards right, if he had been the politician. But he was truth incarnate. He couldn't deny himself. He couldn't deny the truth. And the martyrs are simply following the lead. I mean, Christ says there's no greater love than to lay down your life for your friend. I mean, that's the Maximilian Kolbe story right there. He laid down his life for a man who had a wife and children and said, please let me live. I've got a family. And so Maximilian Kolbe laid down his life for that man in imitation of Jesus Christ, who laid down his life for all of us. And really, Tim, it comes down to, like I said earlier, and I think the ambiguity in our age really comes from people not believing there is a concrete truth that is unchanging. It's all relative. And it's not all relative. I mean, there are things that are relative, but there are basic truths that, and the sanctity of life is one of those primary truths that really, Tim, I was just where you are in Pittsburgh speaking at a pro-life organization. I'm proud to do that because the lack of respecting the sanctity of life, it begins with abortion, but it continues in so many ways. The killings that are rampant, just disregard. And even people's reaction to those killings. When people say, I'm glad so-and-so got shot. I mean, how horrible for human beings. But having just visited Auschwitz, that was an illustration in history that we need to remember of man's inhumanity to man. So when you lose the truth, it's dangerous. You're in peril when you say, oh, it's all relative, because then the relative reality is who has the power is the one that gets to call the shots, instead of saying, we've got to look to truth to guide us, to God, who is truth. When it all becomes relative, that's when the tyranny of you got the power, you got the money, you got the ability to manipulate, just like those men you mentioned in the mall with guns. They had the power. They didn't have the truth. And they were willing to kill people who had the truth because, I mean, that's what tyranny does. It doesn't like the truth because that interferes with their power game of eliminating the truth and just saying, we're in charge. We're calling the shots. And of course, we've seen it throughout human history. And certainly, I mean, many people have said the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history because sadly, we have so many ways to kill people now. You know, mass killings of people are relatively easy, tragically. And I think that's part of the reason there were so many that died. In the 21st century, we're 25 years into it, and there's been way too much death in the 21st century as well.
It's yeah, it's you can have all these technologies to do things for you, but somehow certain people find a way to channel it for that purpose. You also mentioned Charlie Kirk, and I wanted to mention that since it's kind of been on everybody's mind lately. He wasn't a Catholic. He was a very, very devout Christian. He wore it on his sleeve. He spoke it. He preached. These events that he would have, he would say, prove me wrong, and he would debate all sorts of issues, but he always came at it from a faith perspective, and he always brought things back to that as his point of sort of the cornerstone for everything that he would say. And I, like a lot of people, I watched a lot of videos of him. I wasn't in his target demographic, so I wasn't seeing his videos on a regular basis because I wasn't in college. But young people, and I found this out after he died, all the young people that I know, I didn't know how much they paid attention to him until after he died. Then they were very familiar with him. And I don't know. It might be overstating it to say he was martyred because, he wasn't out there preaching and converting and doing these things, but he was killed for what he stood for. Mm. And then and I think this is almost as bad as that is, and it's terrible. What makes it even more disturbing is when you see people reveling in his death. Mm. And I'm shocked really by our society that teachers and doctors and professors, educated people, civilized people can go to that lowest common denominator, right? What was your reaction when you saw all of this?
Well, I agree with everything you've said, Tim. And to me, again, it goes back to a lack, especially the reaction of some. It's like, where is the value of human life? Anywhere. I mean, the Catholic Church teaches from conception to natural death. Charlie Kirk didn't die a natural death. He was only 31 years old, a healthy young man. A bullet took his life, so he didn't die a natural death. And anytime there's a killing anywhere along that spectrum, it is a killing. It is murder. It is taking a life that God has given. And to revel in that, to celebrate it just shows how far people are from the basic values that are Christianity, are the Catholic Church. And it shows how much work we have to do to transform a culture of death to a culture of life once again. Think about, Tim, what a different country this would be if just suddenly, by God's grace or whatever, a switch got flipped and people just said, the killings will stop. All the killing, whatever kind it is, whether it's abortion or it's, somebody grabs a rifle and shoots up a school or a church or whatever. that all of the human beings in the United States just suddenly said, we're going to respect life. It would be transformational in so many ways, because the repercussion, just like the repercussions of a culture of death, it to me is the root of people mutilating their own bodies and not valuing the gift of their life that God has given them. The rampant suicide, the euthanasia that's going on, especially in Canada, and some states in this country are campaigning to pass laws allowing assisted suicide. All of that is rooted in a lack of understanding. Where does life come from? God is the author of life. And anytime we prematurely end it, we're interfering with God's plan. Certainly, I mean, self-defense is a whole other question, but that is one life for another, and you have a right to self-defense. I mean, just like the people you mentioned in the mall, if they had had any way to defend themselves, they had a right to do that. But so many times the power is so overwhelming, and there's really no opportunity for self-defense. But to take another life short of self-defense is interfering with God's plan for life, and it's not respecting the sanctity of life, and that gets us in turmoil that we see constantly. It's just tragic. I mean, the shooting at the church or church school in Minneapolis, all of these shootings, all of these episodes, I mean, the cities, the murder count, all of it is something that we've got to pay attention to. And again, with Charlie Kirk, the irony of the organization that seems to be expanding after his death, Turning Point. To me, I've thought a lot about that. I mean, his death is a turning point, and it needs to be, we need to pay attention to it. We need to, the best memorial for Charlie Kirk, or for anyone, the two children that died in the senseless shooting in Minneapolis, is to work to turn around this idea that we are disposable. And if you got the power, you can dispose of another person. There's too much of that that's in our society, not just in the United States, but we should be a leader of the free world. And sadly, we are leading the free world in too many ways with a lack of respect for life.
That's true. And to that point, I was talking to someone recently since Charlie Kirk died, and I raised a question, and we talked about this, and that is the Annunciation School in Minneapolis that was shot up. That happened 2-3 weeks ago. And if you were to ask people today, the average person, what city was that in? People would already be forgetting that. And 1 week ago, or a week and a half ago, you had the young woman from Ukraine stabbed on a light rail car in Charlotte, North Carolina. Once again, in a week or two, if you ask people what country they might know it today, but a week from now, they might forget. And it's not their fault. It's just that it seems that the information and the pace that things happen because of the media climate, the internet, there's always a new atrocity or something to take its place to sort of erase. And we're on this sort of cycle, like a security video that only holds an hour's worth of footage. We can only hold so much, and we start to forget this stuff. And in the process, we become desensitized, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that is a phenomenon that I don't know the answer, but we've got to pay attention to it and really set down some markers, kind of plant the flag and say, really, Tim, it goes back to 9/11. Imagine both of us remember exactly where we were. It was one of those moments in history. And I was so pleased to see the new patriotism and the ways things that were different. But that faded quickly, and now, and now there's all kinds of controversy that it was all a government plot. It didn't really happen the way we were told. All this stuff. I mean, that noise that diminishes, the resolve to not repeat these atrocities. I mean, again, going back to Auschwitz. I mean, we need to have a memory of what we've done to each other to avoid doing the same thing in the future. And, sadly, like as you said, as rapidly as things move along, a month-old news story might as well have happened in the Middle Ages. I mean, it just fades into nothing. And that is not healthy for a society, to just keep moving so quickly from one thing to another. We're not learning anything. We're not making the changes that need to be made.
No, and there are many. Well, you're in Texas, and there is a group, and again, this goes back to people's misconceptions about the Catholic Church. I would think a lot of Catholics aren't fully aware of this either. And that is, you have the Vatican and you have the Pope and you have everything sort of centrally located there, but in various countries, you have sort of this own culture. And in America, the culture is sort of dictated by the American Conference on Catholic Bishops. And I think in your case, and this is what I wanted to ask you for your perspective on all of this, because you sort of ran into that. And for people that don't know, you sort of spoke your mind and there were things that Pope Francis didn't want to hear, and other people. And then you're part of you're a bishop in Tyler, Texas. You're not, it's not like you're the king of America. You're the Bishop of Tyler, Texas, part of the American Conference on Catholic Bishops. And if you go through sort of a hierarchy, you want your own ACCB to either listen to you, respond to you, take things up, tell you to be quiet, whatever. And you have that culture, and I, I'm not inside, and I've never done work with the Catholic Church, so I don't know this. But my observation is that if there's ever a choice to do something or do nothing, you have a lot of people in the Catholic Church that would rather just sort of let it slide, and so there's this bishop in Tyler, Texas, who's saying things, let him say it and see what happens. And so in that sense, you had a certain amount of freedom to say what you thought. But on the other hand, it's like, well, where's this going to go? What's the logical conclusion of this? Are we going to listen to this man and maybe tell him we agree with you on these things, but let's try these other things, the kind of things you might do if you were a lawmaker in Washington, but they're not. So I guess you have that. So it goes up to the Pope, and the Pope decides, I really don't like what he's saying over there in Tyler, Texas. How did that all work out for you? What was the issue that that sort of, I know you spoke out on a few things. What was the one issue that sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, I don't know that there was one issue. There were, as you said, several issues, but I guess the issue really was sort of the collective, that I wasn't sticking with the party line. I wasn't saying, well, maybe we need to look at what marriage really is. Maybe we need to, sort of there are bishops that argue, as I've said, abortion. They say it's not really the preeminent issue. There are all kinds of issues, climate and the border and all these different things. So it was really sort of a collective of things that I was saying that were contrary to, the party line, contrary to what was this accepted messaging that was going out from the USCCB. And really, Tim, as I had said, I said many times before I was removed as Bishop of Tyler, I was getting in trouble for reading the catechism out loud, for just saying, this is what the Catholic Church teaches. How can we say, well, we need to discuss it or disagree with it or whatever the topic was, I would say, and I always said, I'm glad to be corrected. If I'm misreading the catechism, correct me. Because the Catechism of the Catholic Church is a book that really just puts in basic paragraphs a lot of what the church teaches. I mentioned, what is marriage? You can find it in the Catechism, that it's between a man and a woman. That isn't going to change. And all the discussion in the world isn't going to change that as far as the church is concerned. The same thing, the sanctity of life from conception to natural death, that's in the Catechism. So I read the Catechism out loud, and Pope Francis didn't like it because his ambiguity was saying, well, maybe this needs to change, maybe that needs to change. But if it's the truth, it's not going to change. I mean, I know it's a simplistic sort of approach, but, sometimes for me at least, I guess I'm a simple guy, but, it's like we can legislate all over the place that we've voted gravity out, but gravity's still going to make you jump off a building, you'll find out that the law of gravity hasn't been rescinded. It's the same level of truth that the church has, I believe. No power on earth is going to change the truth. I mean, we can know it more deeply. And through history, we have learned more deeply what the truth is. But we look to Christ to know more deeply and to say, well, we're going to change some things. I mean, frankly, you haven't brought it up, but I'll bring it up. The whole thing on synodality is contrary to the Catholic faith. And Pope Francis started it. Pope Leo seems to be continuing it. I hope and pray that he'll take a different approach. But synodality is about a church that is at least de-emphasizing the hierarchy. And that's not what the Catholic Church is, because at the top of the hierarchy of the church is Jesus Christ. It's divinely instituted. It's not voted in and out. It's not a human organization. Yes, human beings are part of it. It's here for us, our salvation. But the Catholic Church, in the faith of the church and in my faith, the faith of the saints, it's a supernatural, divinely instituted organization. That's the only reason it's here 2,000 years after it began, almost 2,000 years. It'll be 2,000 years exactly in the year 2033 since the church began. What else in the world is still here? Nothing. The Roman Empire fell to dust. All the different empires and all the different nations and everything else is gone. Why is the Catholic Church still here? Not because it had the most brilliant people. Sometimes we've made a disaster of the church in the human way, but because of that divine origin, as Christ said, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so when we don't really believe that, when we treat it like a human organization, then we're really not following the mandate that Christ gave us.
I think you explained it pretty well, but just so that people who are not familiar with that term, synodality, it's you have a synod, and it's one of those. It's not the legislature. It's not the legislature of the church, but it sort of is. It's a way for the church leaders to get together and address certain issues and come up with, I would say, policy decisions or things like that. But they're not the like end all and be all. It's a body that serves a function. But the church is not that body. And it sounds like what you're saying, if I got this right, is there's this move to make the church more democratic through I'm pronouncing it wrong. Synodality. Basically to make things more, and that when you do that, because when you do it in Washington, the only way to succeed is to compromise. So you basically have two Congress people that negotiate, and they both compromise to get what each one wants. And I would think that that's what's going on here. And when you compromise on matters of faith, you're compromising faith itself, aren't you?
Absolutely. And that's where the whole synodality, I mean, certainly coming together and having conversations is good, but not with the idea that through conversation, we can vote truth in and out. I mean, and that's basically what synodality, I mean, that's what the discussion has been about. To me, as it's developing, synodality is a problem because, I mean, it's undermining the authority of the Pope himself. Even though Pope Leo seems to be promoting it, that's why I said I hope and pray that he'll take a different approach. It's one thing to gather people and say, how are you experiencing the truth of Christ and how can we help you understand it more? But it's another thing to say, well, let's look at whether this is the truth or not. And let's discuss whether by majority vote, we want to take a different approach. Other churches, not the Catholic Church, but other churches do exactly that. But that's not the way that the church that Christ established has operated. And it's really not the way she can operate. Because if truth, it's either true or it's not. And if truth is guiding us, it's the common effort that all of us have. And I don't claim to have a full, I mean, I'm not God. I don't understand everything. I don't have a corner on the truth. But what we who don't know all truth, we need to be on a quest to know the truth more deeply. How do we do that? We look to Jesus Christ. And that's what he is, the one that we have to continually look to. It's his church. We are his creation, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God created us. The church exists to guide all of us created in the image and likeness of God. So when truth becomes relative and it becomes something you can vote in or out, then it's really not the truth at all. And it does great damage because, what do we see? That people are running with the idea that, well, I can define truth for myself. You can identify any way you want. And when you start to identify something as someone or something that is so disconnected from the truth, it can become literally dangerous. And that's the devolving of what happens. The further you move from the truth, the further you move into darkness, and darkness becomes dangerous.
I think what you're saying there, people will hear a bishop talk about the truth and they automatically think, well, he's only talking about truth in a religious sense. But I think to your point that you just made, if I'm trying, let's just suppose if I'm evil, and I want to, and I don't mean that like I'm an evil guy, but if I'm the whole essence of evil, and if I want to achieve my ends, the first thing I have to do is convince people that there is no truth, because then I can convince them that my truth is their truth. And examples like that would be, to your point, if I can convince you that there's no such thing as a man or no such thing as a woman, things that the cavemen understood. But if I can convince you with your college degree that this doesn't exist, then I have manipulated, I've brainwashed you, I've got you. And if I get you there, then I've got you for whatever else I want to tell you is true or not. Mm-hmm. And then you can, that sort of transcends into religious practice. I know they're interconnected, but people would say, well, yeah, religion's for church on Sunday, but it's no. Then it comes down to religious theory and religious philosophy. I didn't want to not talk to you. There are three topics that I wanted to ask you about. They are related, but the casual observer might not see them as related. And one of them is Pope Leo XIV, and the other one is the Latin Mass, and the other one is this young people resurgence in the Catholic Church. Generation Z, is discovering not just Christianity, but Catholicism. They like the structure. A 2,000-year-old ancient church with all these, incense and things like that, investments. Why? When I was younger and you were younger, we were going to church and they were singing Peter, Paul, and Mary songs in church. And here, the young people today, our children, some cases grandchildren, are attracted to something that's a throwback 2,000 years. What is it all? How do you make sense of it all?
Well, Tim, I will answer your question in terms of, for each of the three parts, in terms of truth. Pope Leo XIV, he is the vicar of Christ, the human being that's sitting in the chair that Christ established to guide the church that Christ established. He has to be a man doing his best to guide the church in the truth. The Petrine office is essential to the church. And so I pray daily. I pray in every rosary that I pray, and it's built into the Mass to pray for the Pope. And I pray for Pope Leo to be a man strong enough to go against public opinion if public opinion is relativizing the truth. So I pray for Pope Leo to be a man who looks to truth incarnate, that is Jesus Christ, and has the strength. And I know it takes tremendous strength, but I pray for him to have the strength to guide the church and really humanity. Much of humanity that isn't Catholic looks to the Catholic Church. I learned that in Protestant East Texas. Many Christians have told me, we're worried about your church, even though they're not Catholic and don't intend to be Catholic, because it's like the Catholic Church sets the bar, and that bar has been slipping. So with Pope Leo, I pray for him to be bold enough to be a man of the truth. And Jesus Christ is the incarnation of the truth. He is truth living among us. The second part, the Latin Mass. Why is that attractive to people? Why is it essential to the church? Because it focuses on the truth of what happens at Mass for us as Catholics. Forget everything else. It's not about incense. It's about what's the focus. The focus of the Latin Mass is that bread and wine become Jesus Christ, body and blood, soul and divinity. Many people in the time of Christ himself said, this is too much. We're out of here. Many people through the ages, Catholic or not, even before the Protestant Reformation, many Catholics walked away saying, this is just too much. But that is the mystery and the power of the Latin Mass, is it's focused on that truth. As a priest who just began learning it, the Latin Mass, in 2020, I've been a priest for 35 years before I ever celebrated a Latin Mass, and I've still got a lot to learn. But I've learned that it tells the priest and the people, focus on what the truth of what's happening here. Don't worry about your banners. Don't worry about all the stuff that we grew up with. The Peter, Paul, and Mary songs, it should be Jesus, Jesus, Jesus songs. Jesus and Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary. So that's the truth. The reason the Latin Mass is attractive to people is that it brings them to the truth of what the Mass is. It's the Eucharistic sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the truth that he died on the cross and rose from the dead so that he could be with us now in the year 2025 at Eucharistic altars. The last question about the youth, as I think I mentioned already, but look at children. Children get it in many ways. They're young and they haven't learned a lot. But kind of going back to what you said, Tim, who can smell out something fake? A little kid. They can tell that this isn't true, that this isn't real, when their parents are really loving them, they know it. And when mom and dad aren't really loving them, they know it. They may like it. They may say, oh, we get away with things, but they know deep down that parents that aren't guiding them don't really love them. So extend that to the young people, teenagers, 20-somethings that are attracted to the church now. It's because they're in a cesspool of relative mess, and their instinct is for the truth. It's not easy. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the ways we can look at what's going on in the world, if the message being spouted by whatever politician or whatever bishop of the church or whatever leader, if it's the easy path, it's very likely not the truth, because the truth is the tough path. The truth is hard, but it does set us free. And so in all three of those, with Pope Leo, with the Latin Mass, and with young people, it all comes down to we hunger for the truth. I mean, look at Pontius Pilate talking to Christ in the gospel as he's about to condemn him to death. He says, what is truth? He says that to truth incarnate, standing before him, the face of truth. So the mission of the church is to tell the Pontius Pilates of the world, even those who call themselves Catholic, that Jesus Christ is the truth. Look to him. Look to him for your answers. And if you really look at what he says, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be the path of flowers and butterflies. It's going to be a drudgery of carrying your cross, but of being ultimately fulfilled and set free by that life of sacrifice. That's what the saints show us, is that path. The easy path very likely isn't the path of Christ.
It's interesting. I noticed that the Pope Leo will, sing the Our Father in Latin. He's American, and he's really good with languages. I mean, when you hear him speak, I don't speak Italian, but when I hear him speak Italian, you'd think he was born and raised in Italy. So he sings the prayer in Latin, and that sends a message to people who are more traditional, that he sees them, that he hears them. But then on the other hand, he hasn't been the champion for the Latin Mass, that people that want the Latin Mass. And it's not like it has to be universal, that the whole church has to go back to the Latin Mass and no Vatican II Mass. But that's an internal thing for people that don't understand the Catholic Church, but it is a very important philosophical thing for the church. It's how we see the religion. It's how we see our relationship with God. An example, people say, well, what is the Latin Mass outside of the language? Well, in the Latin Mass, the priest faces away from the people and he looks up to God. And in the post-Vatican II Mass, it's more like what people are used to if they would go to a Presbyterian church or a Lutheran church. The priest faces the people and speaks to the people in English, and it's that. That's the one I know. But and I like it. But when people explain the Latin Mass to me and they say, well, yes, but this is where all eyes are on God, including the priest. He doesn't face away from the people because he doesn't like the people. But the most important person in this church is God. And that's what we're doing here. And so that's the philosophy. And I know there's so much more to it than that. But for someone who's, just hearing this for the first time, that's sort of the debate that's happening when people talk about the Latin Mass. And I know that did you know Pope Leo before he became the Pope, being a fellow American bishop? Did you have a chance to get to know him?
No, I didn't meet him because he was he was a bishop, but primarily in Peru. He was a priest serving in Peru as an Augustinian priest, and he was made a bishop and then served in Peru. So no, I didn't know him prior to him becoming Pope.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's he was sort of all over the world and made his way. There's so many other questions we don't have time for that I wanted to ask you, but going back to that use, does that give you encouragement then when you hear these young people flocking to the Catholic Church again?
Oh, absolutely. And to me, really, Tim, it underscores the church is here to stay as long as the world stays. I mean, as Christ promised, the church will be here until the end of the age because God established it with, the human flaws are countless. I mean, you can catalog them, forever. I mean, through the centuries and in our time. But because it's a supernatural organization and divinely instituted, to me, it's logical that young people, young families are turning to the church and turning to the more traditional church, the church that says there is objective truth and it's not all subjective. Then, I guess I would simply say the truth will last. The truth will carry us into the future. And whatever is false, whatever is not of the truth, ultimately will fall by the wayside, whether it's for us just in our own personal journey or for a nation or for the church and the world. If it's false, it's not going to last. It can disrupt things. It can convince a lot of people. I mean, but if it's false, it will ultimately collapse. And that's why you have to hang on to the truth.
I just have one more question for you, and it's one that that would help people if they want to get to know more about you and the work that you're doing today. You founded a group. You're the chairman and the founder. I said that in my intro that you didn't see. The chairman and the founder of Pillars of Faith. And if they want to find you, the website is Pillars of Faith, just like it sounds, pillarsoffaith.net, not .com. What's the organization do? What are you busy with these days?
Well, sharing the truth that is our Catholic faith. I do a weekly podcast called A Watchman's Lamp. And there are various elements there. And the great thing about pillarsoffaith.net as a website, it really is a community of faith that is developing. It just began on August 15th, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary this year. So it's just barely a month old. But it's about nurturing the faith of people, praying. One of the main things is an opportunity to have the team of Pillars of Faith pray for your needs. I mean, we've had a lot of people already that have contacted the website and asked for prayer. I've been asked and am glad to offer masses for people who request a mass for a loved one who's died or someone who's facing cancer, all the different needs that people have. So it's a community of believers really there to support believers and to give them somewhere to say, where can I go to get the truth on this topic or this issue? So that's what the vision of pillarsoffaith.net is. And like I said, it's a month old, but it has a good beginning of really letting people know they're not alone. That, many people have said, well, I'm going to walk away from the Catholic Church because it's such a mess. But I plead with people, don't walk away from the church. Help it to be more fully the bride of Christ that the church is called to be. So that's what Pillars of Faith is. It's a website that I support, and I'm the bishop, but it's really much more than just Bishop Strickland's website. It's a whole community that is really developing more and more.
Sounds like it's almost like a virtual church or a virtual diocese, only it's not restricted by geography.
Yeah. It's just a coming together of believers to support each other and to keep bringing the truth to each other.
Well, that's called pillarsoffaith.net. And I really want to thank you today. So, Bishop Strickland, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tim. God bless you.
The Shaping Opinion podcast is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2025. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like to watch, go to YouTube, Rumble, or our Substack page, shapingopinion.com.